Admiral Vexnor paced the command deck of his damaged scout vessel as it limped through hyperspace. The energy surge from that primitive planet had fried 3 primary systems simultaneously, something that hadn't happened to Imperial technology in centuries. "Report on the human facility," he commanded, his 4-fingered hand trembling slightly, an emotional response he would need to purge before returning to the collective. Lieutenant Zinra projected a hologram of the Antarctic Research Station. 17 humans. "Admiral, their security is minimal. They appear unaware of what they've actually discovered." "What they've discovered," Vexnor said quietly, "is something our science directorate declared impossible 50 years ago." The hologram shifted to show recordings of the humans working. They were arguing, shouting at each other with animated gestures, their faces contorted in ways that seemed hostile. Yet somehow, this chaos was producing breakthrough science. "Are they fighting?" asked Zinra, genuinely confused. "I believe they call it debate," Vexnor replied. "They seem to thrive on disagreement." The most disturbing recording showed 2 humans, clearly in conflict over an equation, suddenly reaching a resolution that neither had initially proposed. Their faces transformed from antagonism to shared excitement in an instant. The quantum measurements following this moment showed the first successful entanglement transportation ever recorded. "Play the audio from their central communication hub," Vexnor ordered. The ship's translator rendered the human language perfectly. A voice, identified as Dr. Eleanor Chen, spoke with unmistakable excitement. "We did it. Quantum teleportation of complex matter across 2 kilometers. The applications are limitless. Medicine, transportation, communication." Another voice interrupted. "Space exploration. We could send probes to nearby stars within our lifetime." Vexnor shut off the recording. "They don't even realize the military implications," he murmured. "They're pursuing this for knowledge." The concept was alien to Zorthaxian thinking. Technology developed for practical application, for the good of the collective. Knowledge for its own sake was inefficient. "How long until they weaponize this?" asked his second-in-command. "Based on their history, months, perhaps days," Vexnor replied. "They've used every scientific breakthrough for warfare eventually." The damaged ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace near the Imperial communication relay. Vexnor knew his report would cause unprecedented disruption in the collective consciousness. A species this primitive shouldn't be capable of such innovation. It violated all predictive models of civilizational development. As they transmitted their findings to the Empire, Vexnor made a final entry in his personal log, something he'd maintained contrary to Imperial protocol. Another small rebellion inspired by his years studying primitive species. The humans achieved this breakthrough through methods we would consider chaotic and inefficient. Their minds work individually, not collectively. They pursue multiple approaches simultaneously. They waste resources on failed experiments. They celebrate being wrong almost as much as being right. He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I believe this is not a limitation, but an advantage. And if I am correct, the Empire faces something unprecedented, a genuine rival. Not in their current technological capacity, but in their potential. They think differently than any species we've encountered in 50 millennia of dominance. The High Council will not want to hear this, but they must." The transmission completed. Within hours, for the first time since the Nexari War 30,000 years ago, the Empire would declare a civilization-level threat alert. And on Earth, oblivious to the storm they'd created among the stars, Dr. Eleanor Chen and her team celebrated with champagne, unaware they had just changed the course of galactic history. The woman on the screen wasn't a political leader or military commander as the Zorthaxians expected. Dr. Eleanor Chen, the same quantum physicist from the Antarctic facility, had somehow become Earth's chosen representative in this crisis. "You have 22 hours, 16 minutes remaining," she continued, her face composed despite the catastrophes her world had just endured. We are tracking your energy signatures across 12 observation points globally. We know you're out there." Grand Strategist Ixora froze the transmission, her six-fingered hands trembling with an emotion the collective rarely experienced. "Uncertainty. Impossible," she whispered. "Their detection technology shouldn't be capable of this." The quantum entanglement research, suggested a junior analyst. They must have adapted it for sensor applications within days of the breakthrough. Adaptation that fast violates all known models of technological integration. Another counselor objected. High Counselor Vaxur, oldest and wisest of the Empire's leaders, raised a hand for silence. "And yet here we are. They have detected our stealth vessels, technology we've refined for 8,000 years. They've survived simultaneous extinction-level events. And now, they threaten us." His voice carried a hint of something almost like admiration. On auxiliary screens, Imperial observers watched human response teams still working furiously around the globe. In Moscow, medical teams continued refining the treatment protocol, already preparing distribution to other affected regions. Along Pacific coastlines, communities were rebuilding with improved tsunami barriers, incorporating lessons from the disaster in real time. Most concerning, the human space agencies had immediately begun constructing a rudimentary orbital defense network from repurposed satellites and hastily launched defensive platforms. "They're preparing for the next attack," Ixor observed, "not celebrating survival, not squabbling over resources, preparing. Their countdown is deliberate psychological warfare," noted the Empire's xenopsychologist. "They know we're watching. They're forcing us to make a rushed decision." Admiral Vexner, summoned from the medical bay where his scout vessel crew was still recovering, entered the council chamber. His preliminary report had sparked this crisis, and protocol demanded his presence for critical decisions. "Admiral," High Counselor Vaxur acknowledged, "you've studied these humans more than anyone. Will they actually hunt us as they claim?" Vexnor considered carefully. "Yes, Counselor. Their history demonstrates remarkable tenacity when threatened. More concerning, they are indicating willingness to develop space combat capability much earlier in their development than our models predicted. They should be at least 3 centuries from pursuing military applications of their quantum technology. And yet here we are," Vaxur repeated, the phrase already becoming a bitter refrain in Imperial chambers. The council chamber fell silent as the implications settled into the collective consciousness. For 50 millennia, the Empire had expanded without meaningful resistance. They had encountered thousands of species, most primitive, some advanced, none a genuine threat. Their protocols assumed either conquest or careful cultivation of potential future client species. Nothing prepared them for this, a primitive species that somehow, inexplicably, jumped centuries of expected technological development in response to a threat. "We have 2 choices," Vaxur finally said. "Reveal ourselves diplomatically, or silence them permanently." The xenopsychologist's voice was grave. Silencing them would require planetary sterilization. Even our most optimistic models suggest they've already dispersed their quantum technology too widely for targeted strikes. Dr. Chen's face remained frozen on the central projection, her countdown ticking inexorably forward. "Very well," Vaxur decided. "Admiral Vexner, prepare your diplomatic team. We will meet these humans and determine their true potential as allies or as the greatest threat the Empire has ever faced." As the council dispersed, Ixora approached Vexnor privately. "This first contact will define our relationship with humans for millennia," she warned. "Choose your approach carefully." "With respect, Grand Strategist," Vexnor replied. "I believe traditional approaches may prove inadequate. These humans do not think as we do." "Then learn to think as they do," she commanded. "The Empire's future may depend on it." When formal negotiations paused for what humans called a lunch break, an inefficient but apparently non-negotiable interruption, Admiral Vexnor found himself outside the Antarctic facility, staring at Earth's harsh blue sky. He had expected fear or subservience from humans once they witnessed Zorthaxian technology. Instead, they treated the delegation with cautious professionalism, as equals, a courtesy the Empire hadn't extended to a new species in 20,000 years. "Your environment suits are fascinating," said a voice behind him. Dr. Chen approached, holding 2 steaming containers. "Adaptive molecular shielding." "Yes," Vexnor admitted, surprised by her accurate assessment. "You've developed similar technology." "No." She handed him one of the containers. "But we've theorized it. This is hot chocolate, by the way. Probably incompatible with your biology, but your scanners might find it interesting." Vexnor's suit analyzed the liquid, confirming its unsuitability but appreciating the gesture. "You've been studying our technology during negotiations." "Of course." She smiled. "Just as you've been studying us since you first detected our quantum experiment." Fair exchange. Their conversation was interrupted by General Okafor's approach. Unlike the scientist's casual demeanor, the military leader radiated contained power. Vexnor's threat assessment protocols automatically activated. "Admiral," she acknowledged. "I'll be direct. Your delegation has avoided discussing the most important question. Why are you here? Not just for this meeting. In our solar system at all." Vexnor hesitated. Imperial protocol dictated a measured truth that preserved Zorthaxian superiority. Looking at these humans, who had survived the Empire's engineered catastrophes and forced this meeting, standard protocols seemed inadequate. "Your quantum entanglement breakthrough," he said finally. "It violated our predictive models for your species development. Such technology shouldn't be possible for humans for centuries." "Because we're primitive?" Chen asked, not offended but genuinely curious. "Because your civilization lacks unified purpose," Vexnor explained. "Our models show that technological advancement of this magnitude requires societal consensus. Your species thrives on disagreement." General Okafor laughed. A short, sharp sound. "That's precisely why we succeeded. Multiple competing approaches, distributed research, no central point of failure." "When your biological attack hit Moscow," Chen added, 14 independent research teams tackled it simultaneously. 3 failed completely. 8 made incremental progress. 1 team from Nigeria identified the counteragent that ultimately worked, synthesizing failed approaches from the others. "Inefficient," Vexnor observed. "But effective," Okafor countered. "And adaptable. Your empire clearly values ordered hierarchy. We tried that approach for millennia. Emperors, dictators, centralized control. It always fails eventually." "Your way is faster?" Vexnor asked, genuine curiosity overriding his diplomatic restraint. "No," Chen admitted. "Yours is faster, when it works. But when centralized systems face unexpected problems, they fail catastrophically," Okafor finished. "While our messy, redundant approach keeps going, different methodologies for different circumstances." As they returned to negotiations, Vexnor processed this insight. The Zorthaxian delegation had approached humans as they would any species: establish dominance, offer protection, integrate them into the Empire's hierarchy. But these humans didn't want protection. They wanted partnership, a concept foreign to Imperial protocols. When the Earth representatives formally declined protected status within the Empire, offering instead a limited technology exchange and mutual non-interference treaty, the delegation's subleaders looked to Vexnor for guidance. Imperial doctrine would interpret this rejection as hostile. Standard response would be a show of force followed by subjugation. Instead, Vexnor made an unprecedented decision. "The Empire accepts Earth's proposal in principle," he announced, knowing the Council would be furious. "We recognize humanity as an independent peer civilization, rather than a protected species." The relief in the room was palpable, from both humans and Zorthaxians. As they finalized preliminary terms, Vexnor realized his contact with humans had changed him irreversibly. He had started thinking in terms of alternatives rather than absolutes. The Council would consider this corruption. He was beginning to consider it evolution. The Zorthaxian engineers stared at Dr. Caftry's improvised synchronizer with a mixture of horror and fascination. The human team had cannibalized their own transport vessels, quantum stabilizers, navigation array, and communication system, combining them with what appeared to be primitive adhesives and manual fasteners. This violates 14 different engineering principles. Chief Engineer Talvor stated flatly. The power modulation is unstable. The graviton containment field fluctuates by 0.03% every 4.6 seconds. The materials are incompatible. And yet it works, Chatry replied, tapping a display showing the component performing above expected parameters. Sometimes elegant solutions aren't the most stable ones. This isn't elegant, Talvor objected. It's chaotic. Exactly, Chatry smiled. Chaos creates opportunities rigid systems miss. The fluctuations you see as flaws. They're actually creating resonance patterns that amplify the output. The Zorthaxian engineer's expression remained skeptical, but he couldn't argue with the results displayed on his monitors. The improvised synchronizer was the final component needed for the array's activation sequence, scheduled for the following day as the black hole's gravitational effects already began distorting Xanthar's outer atmosphere. Later that night, as evacuation ships continued departing from the planet's surface, carrying those deemed most essential to the Empire's continuity, Dr. Chatry found herself summoned to Admiral Vexner's private chambers. The request was unusual. Formal protocol dictated all interactions occur through official channels. The Admiral's quarters were Spartan by human standards, but featured something unexpected. A collection of Earth artifacts, books, printed photographs, even a small potted plant from Earth's Amazon rainforest. You've been studying us for quite some time, Chatry observed. 8 years, Vexnor admitted. Since before your quantum breakthrough, initially as potential subjects, later as something else entirely. Rivals, she suggested. Perhaps, he acknowledged. Dr. Chatry, there's something you should know before tomorrow. The attack on Earth 2 years ago, the asteroid, the power grid failures, the pathogen, they were not random catastrophes. We know, Chatry said quietly. Our intelligence agencies concluded months ago that the events were orchestrated, too precisely timed, too perfectly targeted at different response systems. We suspected you, but couldn't confirm it until now. Vexner's facial membranes fluctuated, the Zorthaxian equivalent of surprise. Yet you still agreed to help us. Humanity has a complicated relationship with vengeance, Chatry explained. Some wanted retribution. Others argued that saving billions of lives, even alien ones, was the moral choice regardless of past actions. We're not a monolith, Admiral. That's what makes you so. He searched for the word. Unpredictable, she offered. Adaptive, he corrected. The Zorthaxian collective consciousness creates perfect unity, but at a cost. We cannot conceive solutions that violate our established patterns. Your makeshift synchronizer is a perfect example. No Zorthaxian would have attempted it because our collective experience deems it impossible. He moved to the viewport, where the black hole was now visible as a dark distortion against the stars. Tomorrow will determine whether your approach or ours is superior. That's a very binary way of thinking, Chatry said, joining him. Perhaps neither is superior. Perhaps they're complementary. Vexnor considered this, an intriguing hypothesis, one the Empire has never tested. Well, Chatry smiled grimly, nothing like an impending planetary catastrophe to encourage experimental thinking. As she left, Vexnor added, Dr. Chatry, there's something else. The High Council didn't approve my confession to you. If we survive tomorrow, I will likely face consequences for this conversation. Why tell me then? Because, he said slowly, I believe trust between different approaches may be more important than consensus within a single one. Another hypothesis to test. Admiral, she replied. I think you're becoming dangerously human. For the first time in his long life, Vexnor allowed himself a gesture approximating the human smile. Perhaps that's not such a terrible fate. As the final countdown to array activation began, Xanthar's skies darkened ominously. The black hole's presence was visible now, not just as a distortion of stars, but as a physical darkness that seemed to consume light itself. Evacuation ships continued launching, though everyone knew most of the planet's 12 billion inhabitants would be left behind if the array failed. In the primary control center, human and Zorthaxian technicians worked side by side. The contrast in their methods was stark. Zorthaxian operators moved with perfect coordination, each action precisely calculated and executed according to established protocols. The humans were more chaotic, calling adjustments on the fly, arguing over readings, making intuitive changes that horrified their alien counterparts. When the quantum field stabilizers began showing variance outside acceptable parameters, the two teams' responses highlighted their philosophical divide. "Shutdown sequence initiated," announced the Zorthaxian lid controller. "Variance exceeds safety protocols by 0.037%. Standard procedure requires full reset." "Belay that," Dr. Katri countermanded, stepping forward. "The variance is within theoretical tolerance. We don't have time for a full reset." "Theoretical tolerance is not tested tolerance," objected Talvor. "The risk-reward calculation isn't applicable here," Chatri interrupted. "This isn't a standard scenario with established parameters. Sometimes you have to trust intuition over calculation." Admiral Vexnor, observing from the command platform, made an unprecedented decision. "Continue activation sequence. Override safety protocol Delta 7. The room fell silent. No Imperial commander had ever overridden basic safety protocols. It was considered a violation of collective wisdom. "Optimization requires exploration beyond known boundaries," Vexnor said quietly, using the human phrase he'd learned from Dr. Katri. "Sometimes we must leap without certainty." As the array powered up to full capacity, the improvised field synchronizer began emitting an alarming harmonic pattern that no simulation had predicted. The Zorthaxian operators froze, their training suddenly inadequate for this unexpected development. Katri's team reacted instantaneously, 3 technicians making simultaneous adjustments while calling readings to each other. There was no central coordination, just rapid adaptation and communication. "The resonance pattern is creating a field amplification effect," Chatri explained, her hands flying across the control interface. "It's actually helpful, but we need to modulate the power flow to compensate." What followed was something the Zorthaxians would later struggle to describe to their collective. Humans executing a complex, cooperative task without telepathic communication or predetermined protocols. They seemed to anticipate each other's actions, building on ideas in real time, creating a solution that no individual had fully conceived. When the array finally activated, the quantum corridor formed precisely as designed, but with 27% greater efficiency than calculated. The black hole's trajectory shifted visibly, its destructive radius compressed as it accelerated through the Xanthar system. In the aftermath, as celebration erupted across the planet, Admiral Vexnor found Dr. Katri alone in an observation bay, watching the black hole recede into the distance. "Your improvisation increased efficiency by 27%, he noted. "Our engineers are still trying to understand how." "We'll probably never fully explain it," she admitted. "Some of it was theoretical physics, some intuition, some luck." "The Zorthaxian way abhors luck," Vexnor said. "We see it as a failure of preparation. And that's why we complement each other," Chatri replied. "Your people perfect known solutions. Mine explore unknown ones. Together, we just saved a planet using methods neither of us could have developed alone." Vexnor was silent for a moment. "The High Council is reconsidering humanity's status in galactic affairs. Your assistance has complicated their understanding of interspecies relationships." "How so?" "For 50 millennia, we've categorized all species as either threats to be neutralized, subjects to be ruled or primitives to be ignored. Vexnor explained. You fit none of these categories. What category would you put us in, Admiral? Katri asked. Vexnor considered carefully before answering. Essential counterparts, he said finally. The missing half of a whole we didn't know was incomplete. As they watched the stars return to normal patterns, neither realized how prophetic those words would prove. In less than 5 years, both civilizations would face an enemy that neither could defeat alone. The Nexari signal spread through galactic communication networks like a virus, adapting to each species' language with perfect precision. When it reached Earth, it bypassed all security protocols, broadcasting simultaneously across every screen on the planet. The entity shown resembled nothing humanity had ever encountered, a swirling, organic mass of interconnected tissues that constantly shifted and reformed, with thousands of eyes that blinked independently across its surface. We have evolved. We have returned. Resistance is inefficient. Join the Unity. At the United Nations Emergency Session, Dr. Katri, now Director of Earth's Sinological Defense Initiative, watched the assembled representatives react with horror to the footage of Nexari bioships absorbing the Zorthaxian colony world. The process isn't exactly death, she explained, her voice clinical despite the grotesque imagery. The Nexari preserve neural patterns of those they assimilate. In their view, they're offering immortality through absorption into their collective. In our view, they're consuming sentient beings, General Okafor countered. The distinction is academic. Ambassador Vexnor, who had remained on Earth as the Empire's permanent envoy, looked diminished. The Zorthaxian fleet's crushing defeats had reverberated through their collective consciousness, creating a psychic shock that affected even distant members. Our tactics have remained unchanged for 12,000 years, he admitted. Perfect, optimized, consistently successful, until now. The Nexari adapt faster than we can refine our approaches. By the third engagement, they had developed countermeasures to strategies that took us millennia to perfect. That's the weakness of a perfectionist approach, Chatri observed. You optimize for known threats, not novel ones. And humanity's approach? Asked the UN Secretary-General. Katri exchanged glances with Okafor. We propose something the Nexari won't expect because no advanced civilization would consider it. Asymmetric warfare on an interstellar scale. She activated a holographic display showing thousands of tiny craft, each barely large enough for a single pilot. The Nexari ignore Earth because they consider us technologically primitive. Their focus is on the Zorthaxian fleet, large, powerful, and operating according to established strategic principles. So we don't fight like the Zorthaxians, Okafor continued. We deploy thousands of stealth microvessels, each carrying quantum jammers designed to disrupt the Nexari collective consciousness. Not a frontal assault, but a nervous system attack. Ambassador Vexnor's facial membranes pulsed with alarm. You propose sending humans individually into Nexari territory. The survival probability is below 12%. Correct, Chatri acknowledged. Which is why we'll use only volunteers. The Zorthaxian collective would never permit such sacrifice odds, Vexnor objected. That's why the Nexari won't expect it, Okafor replied. They think like you. Maximizing survival, minimizing risk. They won't conceive that individuals would willingly accept a mission with 88% mortality projections. The chamber fell silent as the implications settled. Finally, the Secretary-General spoke. How many volunteers would this operation, Babel, require? 3,000, Chatri answered. Each operating independently, without central command once deployed. Absolute mission autonomy. The Empire can provide the stealth technology, Vexnor offered, but not the pilots. Our neural connection to the collective would make us vulnerable to Nexari detection. The Secretary-General surveyed the room. We're talking about sending 3,000 people on what amounts to a suicide mission to save not just humanity, but the Zorthaxian Empire as well. Yes, Chatri said simply. And we already have the volunteers. She activated another display, showing a queue of application forms, over 20,000 submissions in the 6 hours since the Nexeri threat had become public knowledge. Vexenor stared at the display in disbelief. Why would so many volunteer for near-certain death? A young officer standing nearby answered before Katri could. Because each of us who dies might save millions who live. The math is simple, Ambassador. There is nothing simple about such sacrifice, Vexenor replied quietly. No, the officer agreed. But it is very human. Lieutenant Sophia Chen piloted her stealth craft through the debris field surrounding the fallen Zor faction world of Rax Halis. Her vessel, scarcely larger than an Earth fighter jet, but equipped with hybrid technology from both civilizations, was designed for one purpose: infiltration. 6 days into her mission, she'd watched 3 fellow pilots detected and absorbed by Nexeri patrols. Each death taught valuable lessons, patterns to avoid, emission signatures that triggered detection. The survivors adapted constantly, sharing discoveries through brief, encrypted quantum bursts that mimicked normal space radiation. Sophia's target lay ahead, a massive neural relay node the Nexeri had constructed from the repurposed central governance building of the conquered world. Intelligence suggested it coordinated bioship movements across an entire sector. According to her quantum scanner, it pulsed with the neural patterns of thousands of absorbed minds, including former Zorthaxian citizens now forced into the collective. Her tactical approach violated every principle of conventional warfare. Rather than avoiding detection entirely, impossible for extended operations, she programmed her craft to mimic the electromagnetic signature of a damaged Nexeri drone, even inflicting actual damage to her hull to create convincing heat patterns. She drifted directly toward Nexeri patrols, broadcasting the subtle biochemical markers of a damaged component returning for maintenance. The Nexeri, for all their biological sophistication, had one critical weakness: they trusted their own systems implicitly. Why would any entity fake being part of the collective? As she approached the neural relay, Sophia activated the quantum jammer, Dr. Katri's creation, designed to introduce subtle errors into the Nexeri communication frequency. Not enough to trigger immediate alarm, but sufficient to create cascading failures over time as incorrect information propagated through their network. The device was simple: plant it, activate it, leave. But simple became complicated when her sensor array detected something unexpected. A containment field housing recently captured humans, not yet absorbed. 15 life signs, still individual, still themselves. Sophia's mission parameters were explicit: place the jammer and extract immediately. Additional objectives risked the entire operation. The strategic value of 15 lives versus potentially billions was mathematically negligible. But humans didn't make decisions on pure mathematics. She adjusted course toward the containment field, knowing every second increased her detection probability. The Zorthaxian advisors who had trained her would be horrified, sacrificing operational security for an objectively insignificant objective. Sophia deployed the jammer as planned, then executed an approach to the containment field's external control nodes. Her craft's adaptive interface connected with the Nexeri system, a dangerous link that risked revealing her presence. The containment field deactivated. 15 confused humans looked up to see a small craft extending its emergency evacuation chamber, designed for one pilot, now forced to accommodate 16. As they crowded aboard, alarms triggered throughout the facility. Sophia's console flashed with proximity warnings as Nexeri security converged on her position. Her craft, overloaded and underpowered, struggled to reach escape velocity. This wasn't the mission, one of the rescued scientists said, recognizing the quantum jammer's signature as they fled. No, Sophia agreed, pushing the engines beyond safety limits. But it's what we do. When Nexeri pursuers locked onto her emission trail, Sophia made her final decision. She programmed the autopilot to continue toward the extraction point with her passengers, then sealed herself in the rear compartment with the craft's secondary power core. Tell my parents I didn't die for nothing, she transmitted to the evacuees before ejecting in a small decoy pod programmed to emit signals mimicking the main vessel. As necessary forces converged on her decoy, the overloaded craft carrying 15 rescued humans slipped away undetected, bearing both survivors and tactical data that would prove invaluable to the resistance. Sophia's sacrifice, tactically unnecessary, but fundamentally human, would inspire hundreds of similar acts across Nexari territory, each small victory contributing to the growing dysfunction of the collective consciousness. After High Counselor Vexner's speech at the memorial, the assembled diplomats moved toward the reception hall, leaving Ambassador Katri alone before the intertwined Helix monument. 20 years had passed since she'd first faced the Zorthaxian admiral across a negotiation table in Antarctica. Now they shared the highest diplomatic ranks of their respective civilizations, architects of the peace that had transformed the galaxy. She ran her hand along the monument's surface, feeling where the perfectly geometric Zorthaxian metal met the organic curves of human design. The join was seamless, neither material dominating, both stronger together. "It suits you," said a familiar voice. Vexnor approached, his movement slower than in years past, but his presence still commanding. Lost in philosophical contemplation, while everyone else discusses trade agreements. Katri smiled. "Someone needs to remember why we're here." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear as the asteroid's rotation carried them into night. On the horizon, a massive vessel prepared for departure. The Chaotic Harmony, first of the new intergalactic explorers. "Did you ever imagine this?" Katri asked, gesturing toward the ship. "When you first detected our quantum experiment?" "Never," Vexnor admitted. The most optimistic projection was that humanity might become a useful client species in a few centuries. The least optimistic. He left the thought unfinished. "Planetary sterilization," Katri suggested wryly. "It was briefly considered," he acknowledged with the directness that had always characterized their relationship. "Now the thought is abhorrent." "Progress," she noted. "Indeed." Vexner's gaze shifted to a group of young delegates near the reception hall, a mixed cohort of humans, Zorthaxians, and reformed Nexari. "The next generation doesn't remember a time before cooperation. To them, our ancient rivalries seem primitive." "Speaking of the next generation," Katri said, "I've been meaning to tell you. I've accepted a position on the Chaotic Harmony, Chief Science Officer." Vexner's facial membranes pulsed with surprise. "Andromeda is a 3-year journey, even with our combined technologies. At my age, it might be a one-way trip," she acknowledged, "but I can't resist one last adventure." "The High Council will miss your insights," Vexnor said, then added more personally, "As will I." "You could come too," Katri suggested. "They need a Zorthaxian co-commander. Someone with experience bridging different thought patterns." Vexner seemed genuinely startled. "I am nearly 400 years old by your reckoning. Far too old for exploration. And I'm 76, Katri laughed. "Practically ancient by human standards. Yet here we are, still causing trouble." Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of Captain Maya Chen, a dark-haired woman whose features reminded Vexnor of another Chen from long ago. "Ambassador Katri, High Counselor," she greeted them formally. "The departure ceremony begins in 20 minutes. "Thank you, Captain," Katri replied. "Your mother would be proud to see you commanding this mission." Lieutenant Sophia Chen's daughter, Vexnor realized aloud. "The legacy continues. My mother believed different perspectives working together could achieve the impossible," Captain Chen said. "The Chaotic Harmony is that belief made manifest." As they walked toward the ceremony, Vexnor found himself considering Katri's invitation. The Zorthaxian way would be to decline, to remain with the collective, to serve where one's experience was most optimally applied. But 20 years among humans had taught him something vital. Optimization wasn't always found through calculation. Sometimes it emerged from inspiration, from unexpected paths. Perhaps, he said finally, it is time for one last adventure. Katri smiled, unsurprised. I already had your quarters prepared next to mine. I calculated a 78% probability you'd agree. That's a very Zor-Thaxian analysis, he observed. And acting despite a 22% chance of refusal is very human, she countered. We've both changed. As they reached the ceremony, the massive intergalactic vessel gleamed against the stars. Its design neither human, nor Zor-Thaxian, nor Nexari, but something entirely new. Like the galaxy itself, it had become more than the sum of its parts.